I didn't have functional speech. I was 80% meaning deaf, meaning blind. Let's not make assumptions. Let's not make assumptions of how intelligence looks.
So welcome to the Beautiful Reality of Autism podcast. We'll be talking to inspiring parents of autistic children, we'll be talking to autistic adults, and we'll be talking to specialists and thought leaders in the world of autism with the aim of trying to give parents real insights, real inspiration and hope to empower them to build deeper trust-based relationships with their autistic children, build safe, nurturing environments for them to help really unlock their full potential in their relationships with them as they grow. It's brought to you by Transforming Autism, a charity, and all our activities have the same aim as that, to unlock the potential of autistic children, to help families to best nurture them, to provide the best futures for them so that they can have the best lives possible and that society can get the most benefit from them. Today, we're talking to Paul Isaacs. He lived up to the age of 25 before realizing that he was himself autistic. He went through a mainstream schooling without any specialist support, and he was actually non-verbal until around the age of 8. Now his career is speaking about autism and empowering, as we do, other parents of autistic children and people who work with them and deal with them to be aware of the best way of supporting them in life. So, Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and yourself growing up?
Yes, so I was born in 1986. So it was obviously I wasn't diagnosed until 2010. So I was born premature, and part of my autism was brain injury as well. So observations in terms of how I appeared, I was a sleepy baby. I had speech and language and motor delays. My mum's observations were of me being sleepy, and also one of the other observations was me on the sitting room carpet, because we lived with my grandparents for a time, and I was using my non-dominant hand to crawl across the sitting room carpet with my head sort of, I don't know if it was sort of lurched. I'd have to ask my mum about what my head was doing, but nevertheless my legs were sort of splayed out and not moving. Another observation was banging my head rhythmically while I was in the sitting room at their house and smiling. So there was sort of observations there. And in terms of development, my earliest sort of memory of how I suppose I perceived the world was at preschool, and all these visual sort of distortions. Everything was moving, everything was fragmented, and equally the language or the spoken word was heavily distorted. So that was around 3 years old in terms of how I remember things from the earliest point I can remember. In terms of my experiences of childhood, it was layers really. So within the community I lived, I was bullied quite badly. So it was a mixture of verbal abuse, physical abuse, but mostly verbal. Threatened, pushed, kicked, things like that, etc.
So that's quite, it's quite a harrowing childhood. The bullying part of it is obviously very horrible. It also seems to be a pretty much universal experience of autistic people who go to mainstream school. I went through it as well, and I don't know any autistic people who haven't. What would you say led to that bullying? What were the contributing factors to it? And how in today's world where such things are better understood, how could that be dealt with and avoided?
It's a very difficult question to answer because it's where your community lies. And what I mean by that is that the community that you're residing in. I grew up in a community that's unfortunately quite bigoted, and it's not just around disability, it's around sexuality, it's around race, colour, etc. So
Anybody who's
that would
different, almost.
Indeed, yeah. There's kind of a very old-fashioned sort of 1950s perception of people who are different in whatever way I've just described. So it's a very difficult situation if you are in a community like that. How does one navigate such a community where life and worldview beliefs that have just been passed down and regurgitated through generations, how can they change? And I suppose it's the willingness of the individual with the information supplied to reflect and make that change. That's what I've learned over my course as an advocate, that you can supply as much information as you can muster, but there is, unfortunately, and it's not through cynicism that I'm saying this, more realism, where you have to kind of take a step back and think, is this actually worth it? Is it helping? Is it making a real change, either for me personally or looking at it far more broadly or three-dimensionally, such as the wider community or other individuals that are going to be living in that community in the future?
You know, you say that people in your community weren't willing to learn. If there was the openness, what is it that you would like them to learn? What would you want them to know and understand about you that might make a difference to how they integrate you?
Well, I suppose it was understanding, if you're talking about when I was very young, that I didn't have functional speech and that I was echolalic and didn't speak or develop in the way that the other peers within my community did. So it was very hard work both ways. It wasn't just one way; it was both ways. And I suppose initially, if you're just talking about a language and communication aspect, that would have been nice for them to be open and willing to try and understand why I was interacting in such a way and why it was so significantly different. Particularly when I was in sort of younger to mid infancy, than it was to the peer group. They were slightly older, some of them were my age, but a lot of them were older. Just the significance in that would have been probably made a, 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 a grander difference, maybe in the way or in the terms of integration. They may not have fully understand what I was saying, or fully understood rather what I was saying, but it was about just being open-minded and actively listening, which is very hard for infants and teenagers to do anyway. I have forgiven these people, and it's not a sort of facetious forgiveness or a sort of superficial forgiveness. It is a genuine one. I have forgiven them. I've had to. They may well have had their own developmental challenges. They may well have had domestic problems. They may well have had co-occurring mental health conditions that I wasn't aware of, personal things that were going on that I wasn't aware of. By no means am I mitigating bullying or abuse. That's not what I'm doing. It's just a way in which I tried to understand it and actually gain some sort of closure. Because if I hadn't have got that closure, I wouldn't probably be doing the sort of work I'm doing today.
That's part of a really powerful process, and it's a really mature place that you've come to, and I think it's absolutely necessary to come to that in order to thrive in the future. We need to let go of our resentments of the past, and that level of you're asking almost for a much lower level of understanding for yourself, and you've ended up giving a much higher level of understanding to those who didn't give you any understanding. So
yes, that is the nutshell. As long as you know who you are, that's enough. It doesn't really matter what people think of me. as I get older, it becomes highly irrelevant. It really, really does. When you really think about friends that come and go, and friendships becoming fair weathered, and all those sorts of things that happen through life for whatever reason, you do kind of have to have something to fall back on. And I suppose what I fall back on is a, a a grander understanding of the self. Now, I just want to point this out, that it's not a narcissistic kind of indulgence. It's just an understanding of how I operate, my information processing challenges, my mental health challenges, and my personality characteristics. That's what I mean by the understanding of self.
Yeah, I mean, it's a healthy self-acceptance, isn't it? In the way that you're accepting and understanding the people who did that to you when you were young, it wouldn't make sense if you didn't extend the same level of understanding to yourself as well.
That's true. You kind of have to get the balance right between measured accountability of your own behaviour and also understanding how to operate and navigate other people's behaviour.
Do you think it would have been helpful at that time, and it would have made people at least a little bit more open if they'd known that you were autistic? And I ask that because there'll be lots of parents watching this, and parents are sometimes reluctant, even if a diagnosis is available, to pursue that diagnosis because they feel it'll be, there'll be a stigma for their child. But do you think there's also a case in the other direction, that if it's known that you're autistic, then people will, and people will be provoked in a way to find an understanding that they wouldn't otherwise have, even though it would be ideal if they had it anyway?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what I'm saying about the building blocks of community. One would hope in a scenario in a community that if there is a diagnosed individual, a young child, and a family living down the street, that people would, if they're at the very least, would be actively interested and acknowledge that that is what's going on within that household, and that there is an autistic individual living there, or more than one, or potentially the parents are. We can kind of expand on that potentially, can't we, about family dynamics. One would hope that at the very least there'd just be an understanding that they live there. But also, if you want to expand on that further, we have to then look at the building blocks of just how communities are run on a day-to-day level. For example, when you go out into the street or into the close or wherever you live, is it commonplace for people to say hello? Is it commonplace for people to make acknowledgements of your existence? And it could be, very, clipped small talk from good morning or hello, or it could be that they're taking an active interest in what you're doing and want to get to know you better. So yeah, in terms of diagnosis within a community, it is actually about what the community's like prior to that diagnosis.
Yeah. Okay. And we've talked about the community, and we've talked about your schooling. How were things at home? I mean, do you feel that you got the understanding? I mean, I'm sure your parents, did everything for you that they could, but do you feel that they had the understanding, that the education was available to them, that they would have needed to understand you optimally?
I've reflected on this a lot in different stages of my life. The could have beens or the what have beens, or what could have worked hypothetically, or looking back in hindsight. I think looking at what actually happened and how they treated me as an individual, they done very well despite the limited amount of information that they had. They were parents that had their own challenges in their own childhoods, respectively. My father had a lot of domestic problems um, and very challenging issues from a very early age, and my mother also did as well, for different reasons. So the first thing I've got to say is they never ever projected onto me, and if they did, it was worked upon. It's something that I'm actually quite proud of them as just individuals, that they were setting very good boundaries with me, with their stuff and my stuff. I think that was a very good thing to kind of start off with, and they reflected on themselves and they managed and worked through things, which were, let's face it, adult stuff. It's not meant to be brought on to a child. So that's the first thing. So things
just
like,
to clarify, when you say that, do you mean that, they were very conscious that you were different in some ways, and they, they never blamed you for that, and if so, occasionally they let slip, they would make up for it? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, of course, yeah. They're a product of their own generation, aren't they? But what I can say is this: as I've got older, we've had open conversations about some of the things that were done, and then try and build bridges of understanding there. They never pursued things like codependency, so that they had me have a healthy level of autonomy. They never pursued things like being my friend, which can cause it's a psychological phenomena which is a step up from codependency, which is I think it's called enmeshment, where there's no boundaries, there's nothing, and you're my friend, and we're jolly good pals, and that can cause problems as the child
Do you mean sort
grows
of
up.
like almost abandoning the parent role, and
That's
putting a whole
correct.
set of unconsciously putting a whole set of demands on the child by choosing a different relationship with them?
You've hit it. They didn't do things like that, and I'm very thankful for them for doing that. They were selfless. They had a child. That is a commitment. And because I was different, and because as I grew older, my mum's observation was, as I grew older, it became more and more noticeable. So there were things that happened. For example, I went to an ed psych in 1993, nothing happened. Then I went through CAMS in 1996 with depression. I was being bullied by a teacher at my last year at primary school. And then obviously there was observations made about my behaviour and observations about their behaviour. And when I reread the report, it's quite an old report, it's from about 96. There was some worrying stuff there about my parents, to the point of implying things. And at the end of the report, it was saying, we need to keep an eye on my parents, because may have to get social services involved. This
So
is
almost like
awful.
passing the blame away from the people who have done something that's not
Yeah,
particularly the right thing to do, onto the family of the child.
that's correct.
Do you think that still happens? Do you think that sort of stuff still happens, or is that now in the past?
I believe it does, because parents are coming up to me and telling me that they're getting the old caveats of, he's a boy, he's a slow developer. Or maybe you should go on a parenting course, the GP giving out leaflets. Maybe you need to learn how to be a parent. So, yeah, I have heard when I've presented speeches and parents come up to me of these quite worrying kind of perceptions from practitioners, general practitioners who I think need a lot of work done in terms of autism education, because that is the first port of call, isn't it? You go to your general practitioner, you go to your GP, and that again goes back to what I'm saying about community. When my nan and grand were around, you built up a very good relationship with your general practitioner. They called them family doctors, didn't they? They knew your family, they knew your ailments. It was beyond, just a superficial interaction. When you actually went into the GP when you were poorly, you actually felt like you were being listened to and looked after and acknowledged, and to some degree validated if necessary. So I kind of think that dovetails, doesn't it, into, again, how communities operate. And people around them, professionals around them. But going back to what you said about my parents, yeah, they'd done the best they could. I know that sounds like a cliche, but I genuinely mean it. With the limited knowledge they had and information they had at supply, they always made me a part of the family. You know, we went on holiday, we went out to parks and zoos and all these sorts of things. These things may seem quite trivial to other people, but they always made a conscious effort that I was going out and being a part of the world and learning things like failure, learning that failure is normal, right? That failure is a normal path to learning and understanding. Although resilience gets quite a bad rap, and I can understand why. You know, it's not good enough to just say you need to be resilient, of course. But I suppose in some way it did garner me a level of resilience, because I was put into situations that I probably wouldn't have been put in if I'd have been diagnosed earlier. So it's always going to be a catch-22 with my life, you know, the what ifs. But they had to go to those meetings and hear loads of vitriol and criticism about what I wasn't doing. It was never about what Paul was doing. This is my mother's memory. It was really always about what you weren't doing in terms of meetings with teachers.
And there's always pressure on parents, isn't there, to go along with all of that criticism. And it sounds like your parents, you know, accepted what they might have seen and understood as your limitations, and didn't try to change you and tried to do the best possible for you, really accepting you as you are.
Yes, they did. They accepted me as their son. Yes. And maybe, you know, that sounds a very simple sentence, but actually it's completely fundamental in terms of the framework of how they treated me throughout my childhood and beyond.
Presumably they had no idea that you were autistic. That wasn't something that occurred to them.
No.
What would you, looking back now, what would you like them to have known about you, about your experience, about, you know, your needs, about what you needed at that time that they didn't know?
I suppose I would have liked them to have known about a condition called exposure anxiety, which was coined by Donna Williams many years ago. That's an autistic speaker, trainer, advocate, consultant, and author. She sadly passed away in 2017, and it's a condition where, you know, in terms of awareness of self is so awful. You know, the people being and making you aware of your own existence, which would cause compulsive retaliation, diversion responses. So as I got older, to give a bit of context to that, when functional speech came at around 7 or 8 years old, and it was expressively of a 3-year-old, I had to trade in all my what Donna would call pattern, theme, and feel language. This is language before interpretation. So this is all my language. And I had to trade it in for interpretive language, what other people were doing. It was a poor man's version of that. And of course, this garnered exposure. This garnered me being noticed. This garnered observations. So exposure anxiety was its most chronic, was me going into bouts of selective mutism in infancy because of this overwhelming sense of exposure anxiety, which is almost like a chronic dissociative response.
Just to be clear, because I'm not entirely sure what you're saying. I think what you're saying is, before you started to speak, you were, of course, having thoughts and you were formulating thoughts, but it was all in your own way, and you were understanding the world in a way that made sense to you.
Yes.
And it, you know, and you didn't, and the fact that you didn't need to speak and communicate it to somebody else gave you the freedom to sort of almost create your own perception of the world. And then when you started to learn to speak, you had to compromise that because you had to communicate to other people, and they didn't share that same internal view of the world as you, and you had to sort of sacrifice your own view of the world to communicate in a way that they would understand and have a reference point for.
That's correct. Yeah. So because I was literally working with what I had, and
So
there
what
was just
prompted you? So when you got to 7 or 8, what was, I mean, you probably don't remember and you probably don't know, but what was it that made you make, because I guess the difference is most people would start to speak before they become, they might have that process going on of understanding the world in their own way, but before they become aware that they've got that process going on, maybe at 2 or 3, as soon as they get the opportunity, they transition into speaking. For you, it must have been more of a choice. You must have thought at some point, well, this is how I think now. I need to make whether it was conscious or not, I need to make a transition to, or I'm choosing to make a transition to sort of communicate with the world rather than stay in my own framing of the world. What do you think prompted you to make that choice at that time?
I suppose there's a few theories of what happened there. Maybe it was because I was developmentally ready to do so. Another theory could be that there was something inside myself, like you're saying, that was becoming aware of things, of language. If I go back to when I was at preschool, I was 80% meaning deaf, meaning blind, object blind. There was a very, very narrow bandwidth for the interpretive world to even settle in my conscious mind, about 20%. If you imagine a bottleneck, that gives you an idea. With the bottleneck being the input output and the main trunk of the bottle being my mind, it kind of gives you an idea of what was going on. A very narrow bandwidth of interpretive frameworks were going in and out. And of course, assumptions were made. Understandably, I hold no grudges, as I've said before, about cognition and intelligence. So when that came and it didn't marry up developmentally with how my other peers were talking, of course, I think it was a great disappointment. Maybe I was disappointed. Maybe I imagine there was a level of frustration there. And I also think it's one of potentially the reasons why I went back. I wanted to go back. So this thing had came, this awareness, and I wanted to go back. And as a reaction to that, I did have bouts of mutism. Prior to this, at primary school, some of the things I used to do is go around the perimeter of the playground on my own. I used to sing to myself. It didn't make probably much sense to other people, but it was just rhythmic humming. This obviously got noticed by teachers and dinner ladies, etc. But yeah, there was a significant transitional point, a wanting, despite having a huge mountain to climb, almost on leaden boots. It's like wading through treacle, because again, you're trading your patterns for a set of patterns that aren't fully understood, but you understand the basic semantics of them. And as I grew and I progressed, so did my language. But there were still significant challenges, of course. But I think people, when they listen to me now, they're quite surprised that even such a developmental pathway in terms of language happened to me.
It's also an aspect of being an autistic person in a world which is like 98, 99% non-autistic, in the sense that if everybody, if it was 98, 99% autistic, then there'll be many more people going through that process at 7 or 8 years old, and it would be a much easier transition. Whereas because there's certain things that non-autistic people do sooner, there's certain things that non-autistic people do later as well. It sort of puts you at a disadvantage as an autistic person if you're sort of following your natural pathway.
I suppose it does, and people don't, if people aren't going to get it, it's not just simply peers not understanding, is it? It's it's teachers as well.
Yeah, and it's expectations, and it's sort of, it's the obligations almost that people put on you in their own minds.
Yeah, and biases, and again we go back to worldviews, don't we? What we think someone should be doing, or how someone should be behaving, etc., etc. And I suppose going back to the sort of late 80s, early 90s, when I was at school, those teachers, mainstream teachers, may well have had uh, certain expectations, and no doubt they did, of how pupils would behave and where they would be developmentally in each year, as they go up from year 1 to year 2 to year 3, etc. I have no doubt about it that it's not just how one's peers are looking at you, it's also how the teachers are looking at you, and potentially what they're extracting from that and discussing with other teachers, etc. I mean, this is why a lot of the uh, meetings happened, because they were concerned.
Yeah.
The framework of concern was always given through the negative, as I said. There was nothing necessarily for my parents to fall back on in terms of, okay, so what could we do, or what can he do? It was almost like a diatribe monologue. This is what we're going to download into you about what Paul doesn't do, but not actually giving you any expectations or giving you any pathways or anything. So
Well,
my
that is still
mother's,
a very common thing,
it is,
unfortunately.
sadly, isn't it? And it gets written down, and it can be quite, um, it can get quite repetitive, I suppose, if it's just constantly happening, and
Yeah.
you read the notes and they become repetitive in their dialogues about these observations. So it will, again, I do keep bringing it back to culture and community. I suppose it can go anywhere, that theory, couldn't it? Because
Yeah.
a teacher is a human being as well, and teachers have their own frameworks of what they think a child should or shouldn't be doing.
I was interested in your description of, learning to communicate as, having that bottle and almost being able to only sort of get out and take in a small proportion of what you are actually experiencing, and how you were um, experiencing the world, and how you were framing it. Only small part of that could come through the communication. And I guess in a sense, that's a universal thing. That's a compromise we make to be able to communicate with each other, that we compromise our own perspective on the world. But I guess in the context that it happened to you at that relatively late stage, according to what society's expectations are, and what other children were doing at the time, you felt it very, very acutely, and you actually put it really nicely. And I'm wondering whether you still have an element of that. You still are very conscious of almost the inefficiency of communication and the amount that can't be communicated.
Yeah, I mean, as a child, I had extremes of information processing challenges, face blindness, object blindness, meaning blindness, language processing challenges, which would probably be better described as aphasia, where I was hearing pitch and tone but wasn't getting meaning. I was disconnected from my body, so that had an impact on how I referenced my body as a whole. I couldn't, and also how I reference pain. So body agnosias, pain agnosias. Alexithymia meant that I just would not have any sort of emotional opinion on what was happening to me, because I didn't feel it. So going around in an almost sort of quasi dissociative daze. And also the fact that I couldn't recognize thirst, I couldn't recognize hunger, couldn't recognize heat, and things like this. These are all significant things and potentially dangerous. So as I got older, these things I became self-aware of. Obviously, they've changed from when I'm an infant. I mean, what's helped significantly with the visual perceptual challenges that I had is the tinted lenses, which I got at the age of 26. And what they've done is they've helped with the agnosia, the object blindness. So basically, I can see everything in context, or give more context to what I'm seeing. So there's less fuzz and there's less distortion, and everything's glued together, and I can map things out better, and I
It gives
can
it more
track
order in a way.
Yeah, and I can process depth better, depth perception, bodies, faces, facial expressions, things like that. I can track that much better. I can paradoxically process language better, because if this system is working more fluidly, then it opens up my language. I'm able to do what Donna Williams called the shared sense of social for longer. So I used to think until around 27 that, communication was me talking at people or listening. And when it came to me that actually it's a far more fluid affair to actually have this sort of reciprocal conversation where you're talking and you're receiving in real time, and your thoughts are actually being received in real time. So rather than it being like a track, it's actually going like a circle. That was quite amazing to me. And the tints help with that. I'm able to track conversation. I'm able to track my own thoughts better. I'm able to track my language better. It's not all disconnected and discombobulated as what I was describing when I was an infant. If I'd have been diagnosed as an infant, it would have been of the old diagnosis. It would have been of classic or severe or Canner's autism. So then it goes again down the road of, let's not make assumptions. Let's not make assumptions of how intelligence looks. Because if these individuals are looking a certain way and presenting a certain way, and then people are making assumptions about their so-called lack of intelligence, it's quite amazing, isn't it, to realise. And I remember going around Murray Bruce's house. Now, Murray Bruce was a young man on the Chris Packham documentary. And I used to work at the autism base, funnily enough, where he resided as a volunteer. He was a very clever boy, despite having all these challenges. And he's got a very good memory. He can remember how he felt in those situations educationally. And now, through, this technology, he's coming out with brilliant things, even basic wants and needs, there's a humanity and dignity there. But there's also telling his parents how he feels and also what he likes. He loves Shakespeare, science, history. He's an adept and very articulate poet, very emotionally introspective when he types, very deep thinker. So yes, we have to really kind of evaluate and not conflate information processing challenges with one's character. Don't confuse the two. People do it, it's understandable, but try not to, because then you're again you're being trapped potentially by your own biases, aren't you?
Yeah, and I guess you helped to untangle that a little bit, because what I felt through this conversation is, because you've been very aware of the processes you've gone through, you actually break them down and articulate them in a way that make them very clear to people who haven't gone through those things or haven't been aware of going through those things.
Yes, I do. Although I have got functional speech now, I do have, I don't know if the word is a soft spot, but I certainly, for the individuals that continue to, for whatever reason, struggle to have functional speech or are non-speaking, and have got access over time, education, to assisted communication devices, and type and advocate and write books and do poetry and live life and be seen as a human being. I'm connected with quite a few individuals on Facebook, including Murray, but other individuals as well who type to speak. and they're amazing individuals. And it's interesting, this is about parents. You talk about families, that it's so important in their lives that their parents have advocated for them, or significant others have advocated for them. Absolutely the backbone of a lot of why these individuals are where they are, through persistence and not presuming incompetence, which I know sounds very philosophical, but it is true.
Good, Paul. We're coming to the end of our time. It's been really, really interesting to hear your thoughts on all of these things. I always like to end the conversation by asking 3 quick fire, not quite quick fire, but relatively short questions, because some of them are quite big as well. But we're going for a sort of targeted answer, if we can, to each of these. The first is, in your understanding, in your experience, in the way you frame things, what is autism?
It's a good question. I mentioned her briefly during our dialogue. I think autism is a fruit salad, and I'm going to extract what that sentence means. Donna Williams created the fruit salad analogy in its infancy in 1995. And the fruit salad analogy is an empowerment model of disability. Nobody is left behind with this model, and it breaks down autism into its parts. So you've got information processing, identity, personality, mental health, environment, and learning styles. I'm giving you a very basic analysis of this, but what I like about her analogy is that it's egalitarian, it's not hierarchical, it's specific, it gets the guts of what autism is in a general sense, and then specific for the person. She's the individual who actually started talking about people who type to speak long before it was considered a thing. So this was in the 90s when these individuals were presumed to be frauds. She was advocating for them. She was also advocating for the individuals that have dietary disabilities, gut, immune, and metabolic challenges, which she has, type 2 diabetes, vitamin deficiencies, gut problems. She had them. So when you kind of look at it, she's looking at autism in the round. It's 3-dimensional and it's person-centered. So when I do my work, so when I present, when I do consultancy, when I do training, I'm always mindful that my autism is my autism, and someone else's is a completely different experience, despite sharing the same diagnosis. So hopefully that answers that question.
Second question is, what would you say for parents of autistic children? What's the most important thing for them to know, to be aware of, to remember? What's your message to autistic parents?
Whatever label is given, whatever word is being used, whether you view it as an adjective or a noun, we've had that discussion privately about identity and things like that. Please, I urge, remember that they're a person. Never let them forget that. Never let them forget that they're a human being, despite the challenges that they may have or may face. Just keep that on track. Keep reminding them in all sorts of different ways that they're a person of value.
And in your perfect world, how is autism understood and integrated?
It kind of falls back slightly on the first answer. So how autism is understood is that, or how it potentially needs to be, is it's a 3-dimensional condition made up of conditions. So when we look at autism in the general, we can do that. But when we're porting that over to looking at specifics, when you're looking at individuals, we have to be very mindful that we know what type of autism fruit salad we're looking at, that we've got the capabilities to advocate for it. And if we haven't, we have to port that over to other individuals.
Paul, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.